Hello and welcome everybody to NISA's Winter Economic Forum for 2023. My name is Stephen Millard. I'm the Deputy Director for Macroeconomic Modelling and Forecasting here at NISA. The way we're going to run this session is as follows. I'm going to basically welcome you. I've already done that, I guess. But we then have Barry Naisbitt, who's going to talk us through the global economic outlook. We have Kamar White, who is going to talk us through the UK outlook. And then we've got Arnab Bhattacharjee, who's going to talk through the regional outlook. Between them, they should take around about a half hour, which will allow us half an hour or so for questions. If you would like to ask a question, please could you write the question into the chat, and then I will come to people in turn. We will unmute you, enabling you to ask your question. But please put your questions in the chat first. I think that's all I need to say, so I'm going to hand over straight away to Barry.
Hi and good morning. Welcome to everyone, and thank you for signing up for this NISA event. I'm Barry Naisbitt, Associate Research Director for Global Macroeconomics, and my job today is to present our global economic outlook, which we do quarterly. It's very much a team effort, and I'd like to thank the other members of the team, named on the slide here, for all their hard work in helping to put it together. If I move on to our forecast itself, it's just worth noting that last year we estimate that the global economy grew by 3.1%. That would make it, if we accept 2019 and 2020, the slowest year of global growth since 2009. We expect growth to slow further this year to 2.3%, largely reflecting the ongoing effects of war in Ukraine, the high inflation that we have already seen, and inflation is still running at high rates, and the tightening in monetary policy that we've seen in response to that. But then we're expecting GDP growth to pick up a little bit in 2024 and a little bit more in 2025. In terms of where does that leave sort of the world economy in terms of growth rates looking? Well, although we're expecting this pickup in growth next year, it's just quite interesting, I think, to look at where growth rates are relative to where they were before the pandemic struck. So on this chart, the red diamonds show the average annual growth rate in the 5 years leading up to 2019. And the black bars show our estimates or projections for growth in 2023, and the sort of pinkish bars show 2024. And as you can see, in almost all cases, Japan being the exception, but again with a slow growth rate anyway, we're expecting global growth in these economies to be slower than we have seen in the years running up to the pandemic. One of the things that people have asked us is about how does our forecast play against the IMF's forecast? Well, the IMF, this table provides the answer, but in short, the IMF is more optimistic than us on most countries apart from the UK, where we are more optimistic than the IMF, or alternatively, the IMF is more pessimistic than we are. And Kamar White, my colleague, will be talking about our UK forecast after I've finished on the global outlook. It's interesting to note that our forecast really, in terms of the fan chart, we've got a sort of balanced view on the risks around our central case, where the IMF talks about the risks being on the downside in their global forecast. In terms of inflation, we think inflation has peaked when you look at it, certainly in terms of average annual figures for year-on-year inflation. But when you look at the details of monthly rates of annual inflation, I think the situation's a little bit more complex. The left-hand chart shows headline inflation for 5 of the G7 countries. And we have a box, a short article, if you will, within our global economic outlook that looks at inflation in detail. And we argue that we think that inflation as annual terms has peaked in the US and Canada. It peaked in the middle of last year, in fact. But if it has peaked in the euro area generally, the peak is much more recent. And in fact, in Japan, may not have peaked yet at all, with inflation at a high of 4% in December. But in terms of core inflation, that's inflation excluding energy and food prices, the picture is much more mixed. And it's much harder to conclude, the right-hand chart on the picture here, that core inflation has actually peaked now, or peaked already, and may actually be signaling more persistent inflation for this year and perhaps even into next. Also in the box, we provide some simple projections, simple scenario based on the idea that monthly inflation over the next year, over this year, could be an average of what it was in the past 6 months of last year. And these two charts show the results of just doing that simple simulation. And what you can see is that if that were to come about, annual inflation would fall quite sharply in Canada and the US. But in particular, Japan and Italy would be two countries in which inflation at the end of this year would be higher than the end of last year. Now, it's not to say that inflation will actually run at that rate, but looking at that, if we were to repeat the experience of the past 6 months, we would be seeing inflation coming down in most of those economies. How monetary policy responds, of course, will be the key, and how that works through. And in terms of inflation also, it's worth noting that when we look at euro area inflation, what we're seeing at the moment, if we break it down into the individual countries, is a wide range of experience, with some countries inflation nearer to 25% than they are to 2%, or much nearer to 25%. And the dispersion, the grey range there in the chart, is now at a sort of record level. Although it's interesting to note that in the past couple of months, that dispersion has actually dropped a little bit as some of the higher inflation rates have fallen out. In terms of monetary policy, the rapid rise in inflation has led to a particularly aggressive tightening in monetary policy. These two charts, the left-hand side shows the ECB, the right-hand side shows the US, and you can see there that the red dotted lines represent the current tightening. The speed of tightening, the x-axis should on both sides say months from start, is faster than it has been in previous tightening episodes. The key question is obviously, when is that tightening likely to halt? And our forecast is based on really taking market assumptions. And when we move to the next slide, we'll see that those market assumptions and our view shows that basically we're expecting the peak of interest rates to be this year, but we're not expecting, and i.e. markets are not expecting interest rates to come down very quickly. So by the end of 2024, we've got US interest rates down about 75 basis points from their peak, but euro area interest rates only about 25 basis points from their peak. So we don't expect a rapid unwinding. As usual in our global economic outlook, we have a NIGEM topical feature article. NIGEM is our global macroeconomic model. And we try and use that feature to examine simulations in the model, and particularly a particularly interesting issue. And the issue we've focused on this time is about growth in China. And you can see that our central forecast, our baseline forecast, is that growth over this decade in China will be slower than last decade, and last decade was slower than the decade before that. So we're seeing a picture of growth in China slowing down. And one of the things we're looking at in this particular feature is sort of a longer term effects of China slowing down, where we simulate both a slowing in technical progress relative to our baseline and a slower population growth relative to our baseline. The scenarios show that the technical progress effect tends to work through in the way we've constructed it over the next sort of decade, really. As you can see on the left-hand chart, which shows the percentage difference in GDP from base. But the population effect, where what we've done is take the United Nations low fertility projection, as opposed to the mean projection, which is the one we use in our baseline, tends to kick in to our projections for GDP growth, or GDP, over the decade that would begin in 2030. So the impact of this is to give lower level of GDP in the longer run, and hence slower growth in that period to the longer run. And we also examine how it affects other economies. So the right-hand chart, the first part is set at year 5, the second part is set at year 20, where the population effect is starting to have a noticeable effect. And what you can see from the scale of the bars is that the larger effect of falling GDP relative to a baseline in China is on emerging economies rather than advanced economies. But there is slower global GDP growth as a result. And GDP is around 0.1% lower, I guess, around that level in the longer term. Let me just leave you with our summary of our forecast, and just to say thank you ever so much for listening. And I'll hand over to my colleague Kamal White, who's going to present the UK economic outlook.
Thank you, Barry. And morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our economic forum this morning. So I'll be giving this short presentation on the outlook for the UK, and this is very much a team effort, and the rest of the team names are listed on screen here. Now, just as a sort of outline to the presentation, I'll speak a bit on the outlook for growth, that's GDP. I'll talk a bit about labor market and wages, before then turning to what's happening with inflation and how monetary policy is responding to try and tame this inflation, and then finally just conclude and speak about some risks to the forecast. So on GDP, so our central case forecast for this year is one that is sort of cautiously optimistic, in the sense that GDP outlook remains relatively favorable, with the United Kingdom essentially avoiding what we term a technical recession. Now, we would have seen the numbers this morning from the ONS, which suggests that we've had a flat Q4 and a small contraction in the first quarter of this year. Now, this is very much in line with what our monthly GDP tracker has, and that has, sort of fed into our forecast for the outlook going forward. So we're expecting anemic growth for GDP just to the tune of about 0.2% in 2023. That's relative to 2022. And given that, and coupled with the sort of cost of living crisis that we are experiencing and the possibility of rising unemployment, households will certainly feel like they are indeed experiencing a recession. We are currently forecasting GDP in the first quarter of 2023 to be lower than that of 2022. And what this might suggest, it raises the question of how we think about defining a recession, if you like. And one might want to consider a definition which is suggested by the National Bureau for Economic Research and Business Cycle Dating Committee, who define a recession as a sort of significant decline in economic activity, which is spread across the economy, lasting more than a few months. So it's worth thinking about a recession with a sort of broader definition rather than the one that we're typically used to as a technical recession. Now, returning to the labor market, so we expect the anemic growth over our forecast to lead to a rise in the unemployment rate. Now, given the current sort of high vacancy rate, we expect companies to start by first withdrawing vacancies and then by laying off workers. And as a result of this, we expect forecast unemployment rate to rise steadily, reaching a peak of around just over 4.5% in the third quarter of 2024. So at that point, as you can see from the graph, the actual unemployment rate will be closer to our estimate of the natural rate of unemployment. Up until then, we expect the labor market to remain fairly tight in the sense of that it will be contributing positively to wage inflation. Now, given the tight labor market and the persistent inflation, we expect that nominal wage growth is going to remain high over the duration of our forecast. For this year, we see the current wave of industrial unrest leading to higher pay growth in the public sector. That will sort of ensure that aggregate earnings growth remains around 5% throughout this year and into the first half of next year. However, given how high we think CPI inflation is likely to be this year, this still implies that nominal wage growth will fail to keep sort of pace with price inflation. So in other words, we expect real wages to continue to fall through 2023. Now, what does this mean then for real personal disposable income? So the fall in real wages has led to, of course, a cost of living squeeze and a fall in real personal disposable income. And as we can see this from the black line in the chart, falling by 2.3% in last year. However, we expect RPDI to start rising in 2023, so that's this year, albeit a bit slowly. And this is mainly due to slowing inflation rate that we are expecting and an increase in nominal earnings and government transfers in response to the cost of living crisis. Over the medium term, as price inflation sort of comes down a bit below nominal wage growth, we expect to see real incomes grow by around 1%. Now, turning to inflation, now we saw from the latest ONS figures that inflation fell to, that's 12-month CPI inflation fell to 10.5% in December from 10.7% in November. Now, despite the welcome falls in the headline rate, annual inflation rate remains among the highest in sort of 4 decades of the Bank of England inflation target of 2%. And we've seen CPI inflation excluding food and alcoholic beverages and tobacco. Essentially, if you think of our CPI tracker that we put out, our trim mean measure of CPI inflation remained at 6.3% and the core inflation at 9% respectively for the second month in a row, which suggests to us that inflation is more sort of widespread. So these measures of core or underlying inflation suggest that despite the falls in the headline figure, inflationary pressures may not yet have cooled in the UK economy. And as a result of high and persistent core inflation and the likely higher wage inflation resulting in part from the sort of current wave of industrial unrest that we're seeing, we continue to expect inflation to remain persistently above the Bank of England's target. Specifically, we expect CPI inflation to fall to only about 5.3% by the end of this year and not reach a Bank of England's target of 2% until the third quarter of 2025. Now, how is the Monetary Policy Committee responding to that? Now, against this backdrop of high inflation, the MPC has raised rates for a 10th consecutive time in February at that time about by 50 basis points to reaching to 4%. Now markets are, placing a roughly equal probability on the bank rate peaking at either 4.25% and 4.5% in May of this year, followed by a gradual unwinding or normalization, if you like, in 2025. And the chart you see here just shows how our sort of forecast and markets have developed from our last forecast compared to our current forecast. Now, since the Bank of England gained independence in 1997, the current tightening cycle is the most aggressive in terms of pace and magnitude of rate hikes, as you can see from the chart here, the burgundy line representing the most recent in 2022. But of course, the annual inflation rates that we have seen throughout the course of 2022 are by far the highest that we've seen during this period. So the implied movement in real rates has been smaller. Now, in addition, one could argue that one of the reasons for the speed of the rises is that the MPC were somewhat behind the curve in that they started the tightening cycle after inflation had already started setting in the economy. Now, just to conclude, so starting with inflation. So as we've said, and as my colleague Barry has said in his presentation of the global economy, we believe that headline inflation has peaked, but of course, the ongoing war in the Ukraine, as well as the current wave of industrial action, that makes the path of inflation over the next year or two particularly uncertain. Core inflation is high and has not yet clearly peaked, so there's risk that core inflation could rise further or remain much higher than the MPC's 2% inflation target. Similarly, if the current wave of industrial action results in faster wage growth in the private sector, then there's a risk of firms passing these wage rises into higher prices, and then there's a potential clearly of a wage price spiral. On the downside, there's a risk that the inflation falls faster than we're expecting because of the large falls that we've recently seen in energy prices. Now, on a separate sort of risk to inflation, and this is now on both the up and the downside, and that is the sort of evolution of monetary policy, which I've discussed. Now, on the downside, it may be, and this is as the MPC and the OBR recently suggested in their recent forecast, that if the MPC raises interest rates in line with the current market curve, that this may increase the likelihood of recession, leading to sort of faster fall in inflation. And of course, the OBR's November forecast for inflation suggests that there was, a risk that headline inflation could even go negative. So, taking that into account, there's a possibility that the MPC start loosening policy too soon, as they are sort of worried about the perception of being behind the curve again in loosening policy, as they were, seen to being behind the curve in the tightening cycle. So if this were to happen, then it could, of course, result in higher inflation becoming embedded in inflation expectations, and then much more persistent period of high inflation would be then clearly be experienced. So the timing and the responsiveness of the MPC in such a sort of dynamic setting of circumstances would be key to minimizing these risks, both on the upside and on the downside. In terms of GDP, so as I said at the start, we think that the risk are sort of symmetric. Our central forecast is for anemic growth in GDP this year, but on the upside, we're sort of positively surprised by GDP at the back end of 2022. As I mentioned before, we saw sort of a flatlining of GDP in Q4 last year, and that was revealed this morning. It is possible that this could, continue into the first half into 2023, and despite, or trackers suggesting negative, a small negative growth in the first quarter, Q1. So this could sort of help households to continue to use up savings they have accumulated over the COVID period to maintain consumption in light of the cost of living crisis. Now, in light of this, there's risk that gloomy consumer and business confidence could lead to a deep or sort of protracted recession over 2023. And this is clearly in line with the MPC's recent forecast. So on balance, the UK economy remains fairly resilient, albeit at low levels of growth, but the risk to the outlook are certainly built in. And I'll just leave you with a summary of our forecast as I hand over to my colleague Arna to speak you through the regional forecast. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamar. Well, and welcome everyone to our winter 2023 economic forum. I'm going to bring you the UK regional and household outlook, which is joint work as ever, together with a fantastic group of colleagues here at the National Institute. So overall, we have three important messages. The first one is one of the squeezed middle, the return of the squeezed middle, widening regional inequalities. Now, the two of these are sort of tied in with, cost of living and leveling down, and its dismal discontents that have important ramifications across the country, not just in inflation, but also in more broadly in the performance of the country and its regions, and the life circumstances and experiences of individuals and households. And I guess by that backdrop, we are going to suggest some policy options that the government can consider. We are also going to evaluate how the policies that the chancellor, the successive chancellors have implemented, how they have, what effect they have had. So in terms of the squeezed middle, there are two things to say here. I think before we go to the chart, if we can just summarize the points a little bit on the previous slide, please. So household disposable incomes in any case have sharply fallen since COVID, and that is the backdrop to much of this. So real personal disposable incomes, Kemar has talked about, they have contracted 4 quarters, leading to significant risk. But this trend has been going on for a while. At the household level, this has contracted by as much as 18% for the lowest quintile since the beginning of the COVID period. And even for the top quintile, it has contracted 9%. Against that smaller disposable income, households have then been hit by a cost of living crisis, leading to higher inflation, particularly in energy and food, which again affects low-income households more. But government support has been coming in, and our view is that this has supported to a large extent the impact of inflation upon households in the lowest decile, so who see only about a 0.5% hit to their disposable income, whereas in the middle income groups, that is in deciles 2 to 5, they might see as much as a 13% shock to their disposable incomes, which are already very low. This is depicted in the graphic here on this chart. So the blue bars there are the effect of inflation, and the red or maroon ones are the ones due to the May grants and the autumn statement. Bear in mind, of course, that there is a little bit more coming by way of income tax thresholds. The effect of freezing them is also going to put somewhat higher pressures on household disposable incomes in the coming quarters. Now, obviously, this has different implications for different parts of the income distribution. And here we portray this for two different parts, one for the poorest households, where you can see that on the gray is the effect of inflation, which is largely mitigated by grants in the form of £900 support for households on universal credit, plus additional support for disabled persons and so on. So those effects have come in. However, the same is not true for households in the middle of the distribution, where we can see that the large effects of inflation are largely not met by an equally robust policy response from the government or from the chancellor. Now, how much robust it can be and how much robustness is required there is a moot point, but the central message that we want to bring forward is that policy has acted largely on households in the lowest decile, but for some reason, they have left many households in the middle incomes, in middle part of the income distribution, largely unsupported. So essentially, the message is that the February and March measures were insufficient. The 26 May measures were a step in the large direction, but it was largely an universal subsidy. And the autumn statement has is bringing in support for the households and individuals at the lowest end of the distribution. But this only came in, remember, since November. So they have already borne a large part of the inflation shock. Now, moving on to the key messages for the regions, the divergence continues to be there. Northern Ireland and the Northeast will see significant destitution or people in abject poverty by 2024 Q4, as much as 32% of households in Northern Ireland and 30% in the Northeast. And these disparities are widening. Output in London, for example, is projected to grow by 9% above its pre-pandemic level, to a level 9% above. However, at the same time, there would be a 1% drop in the Midlands. Similarly, in terms of productivity, whereas productivity in London and the Southeast continue to increase at moderate rates, already over the very high levels that they have achieved previously. In the Midlands, particularly the West Midlands, the situation is going to be different. The divergence between London and other parts of the country can be very clearly seen here. In this case, in terms of regional output, London being the dotted line at the top of the top chart, and related to that, all other parts of the all other regions, English regions, lag behind, but also all other devolved nations, except for a temporary uptick in Scotland around the time of COP26, but its effect is also almost went out. A similar picture can be seen in terms of employment and in terms of regional productivity. As mentioned, there is really a two-horse race here. So it means London powering ahead and increasing its productivity even more, whereas other parts of the country struggle. So this leads us to the question as to what should government support be, and with their leveling up. So in terms of government support, what we suggest is, particularly with respect to energy bills, which are projected to still remain quite high and actually perhaps even grow by 25% even in the next year. The government has suggested a social tariff, but thinks that it can be, because of institutional reasons, can be brought in only by 2024. We suggest a system of opt-in before the government can beef up its data collection mechanisms or information gathering mechanisms, whereby households who are struggling can be provided support beforehand. Together, a variable price cap is a way for us to think through how we can achieve, perhaps progress towards net zero in a way that is fair for all regions of the country and across households, across the income distribution. So together, we think that we can strike a better balance. In terms of leveling up, well, there are ambitions, but in order to turn this into reality, particularly against substantial pressures upon government finances, we suggest that all leveling up funds should be integrated into a unified system, simplified and transparent, based on socioeconomic criteria, and the applications processes can be rationalized substantially. And one can consider creating a national development bank by bringing together various investment vehicles, for example, the UK Investment Bank, replacing the 7 million funding lost since Brexit, and being endowed with 50 billion to finance large-scale long-term investment, which again will go a long way, we think, towards addressing the productivity problems of the country. In conclusion, then, households need more certainty and fairness in terms of their energy support. Policy should intervene early, should not increase uncertainty, but rather support individuals and households. And leveling up requires a switch from a short-term view to a long-term investment strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you ever so much, Arnab, and indeed, Kamar and Barry as well. We're going to have time for questions now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to collect questions in batches of 3, and then ask our panelists to answer them. I hope they can do that. That way I won't have to, which is always good. So can we start with Nick Catton? Nick, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
We'll just need to unmute him in a minute.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Nick. We need to unmute you, apparently. Any luck?
Okay, can you hear me?
We can, thanks. Go ahead.
Great. So thank you. Thanks for the presentations.
Hello, lost you again, Nick.
So is more optimistic on the UK than the IMF. But I had a quick check against the published consensus, and it seems that you're more optimistic than everyone for the UK for 2023 GDP growth. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about why that is, and whether you've made any particular judgments or assumptions that's driving that, or whether that's a feature of the model framework that you're using.
Okay, thank you very much. Kimar, we'll come back to you in a bit. Why are we so much more optimistic than everybody else? Next question I have is from Amanda Bailey. Amanda, do you want to unmute yourself, or we'll unmute you and then you can ask your question?
Hi, yes, I wanted to ask a question about the forecasts around Northern Ireland and the North East, which are clearly deeply concerning, and you covered it briefly in your slides about both parts of the UK seeing significant destitution by the end of 2024. Clearly, we were already going in the wrong direction in terms of regional inequalities before the pandemic. And to find that prediction, to me, is very concerning. From an organisation called the North East Child Poverty Commission, we already have the highest rate of child poverty now in the whole of the country. And yeah, if you could just say a bit more around how you came to that conclusion, it would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll ask Arnab to do that in a minute. Finally, though, can we have a question from Alex Cook?
Hi there, can you hear me?
We can indeed. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So my understanding is that UK productivity growth never really recovered after the global financial crisis, and it's lagged equivalent countries like the US, Germany, and France over the last decades. Does the panel have evidence on recent productivity growth? Is that decoupling set to continue? If so, I imagine there's quite a lot of factors underpinning it, not least FDI uncertainty following Brexit. And Arnab talked about the policy prescriptions for solving inequalities in productivity between UK regions, but what about achieving convergence with the UK's peer countries? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Well, we'll tackle those questions in turn. Kimar, if you want to take on the why are we optimistic question. Arnab, how did we work out the number of people sliding into destitution in the Northeast? And productivity, Barry, I don't know if you have anything to say on the global productivity, or if not, I'll take that one. Kimar.
Thank you, Stephen, and thanks for the question. And it's a good question, and as you rightly said, we are more on the optimistic side compared to, for example, the IMF, but also to consensus. And the reason for that is merely the fact that we considered that on the second half of 2022, we've seen a sort of stronger than expected back end of 2022, and we think that, you know, we might see some of that, you know, sort of spilling over into 2023. So having a sort of stronger 2023 than would have otherwise been. So it's and again, the numbers that came out this morning from the ONS, i.e. the flat line in Q4, which is largely in line with what we had expected Q4 to be. I remember prior to Q4 data, there was a lot of noise of Q4 being quite negative, but it has come out to flatline. So we expect that some sort of base effects will take effect in 2023, making our forecast a bit more positive. But I'd like to sort of just highlight or just make clear that, again, the growth that we're seeing for 2023 relative to 2022 is a very small one, anemic, if you like, of 0.2%. So even though we do not have a technical recession, as most have in their forecast, with the cost of living crisis that we've seen and the potential for rising unemployment, I mean, household will still feel like as if they are experiencing a recession. So in short, to answer your question, it is, you know, assumptions that we have imposed based on our nowcasting model and based on realized data. Thank you.
Thanks, Kimar. So we're optimistic, but life is still bad even in the optimistic forecast, which is not the best of messages to take away. Arnab, if you want to now explain how we calculate how bad life is for particular households, I'm sure that would be appreciated.
Yes, thank you very much, Stephen. Brilliant question, Amanda. Right, okay, so this is crystal ball gazing a little bit, but here's how we go about it. So already as a result of the impacts of COVID and following on, you know, together with Brexit and the cost of living crisis in general, the circumstances in the north and west of the country, particularly Northern Ireland, have been quite a bit divergent from the more better performing regions of the country itself. Now, what this does is that on top of very strongly falling disposable incomes in real terms, the cost of living or the inflation effects, particularly coming from energy prices. So the north and west of the country are also the wetter and colder parts of the country. has together these two, the distribution effects of already having more poor households there and having sluggish economic performance together with the the being colder and wetter gives rise to these indeed very dismal numbers. Now, having said that, we are not suggesting that all of these households, the 32% in Northern Ireland, might have to, there may be some respite for them, partly from drawing down upon savings that some of these households would have accumulated over the COVID period, so the COVID savings, and maybe some recourse to borrowings as well. Mind you, of course, the borrowings are at higher rates now because the interest rates are going high. So despite that, the overall effect is substantially large. One of the things that we are planning to do is to model more appropriately the credit markets. We do not yet have sufficient data on how a credit activity has moved over the past few quarters. Now, once we have a clear sense of that, we will be able to understand better what recourse people might have, at least from taking on further borrowings to support their consumption against the situation where many households are having to choose between eating and heating. So this is a evolving situation, but we are trying to analyze this to the best that we can at the moment. I hope that answers your question, but I'm happy to take this aside as well and engage in. You guys do fantastic work, and so it's very much appreciated. So we would like to have a follow-on discussion with you as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Arnab. Barry, how are we doing productivity-wise vis-a-vis other G7 OECD economies?
Well, in brief, the answer is we're not doing that much any better than we have been doing. But that sort of rather flippant answer, I think a more detailed answer would probably just look at two things. One is that there is an abiding question, I think, that's permeated almost the whole of the post-war period in the UK as to why UK productivity has been lower than in comparable countries. I mean, the typical figure that is quoted, very much broad brush, is that a French worker does in 4 days what it takes a British worker 5 days to do. Clearly, it's not true at the National Institute, but it must be true in some other places. And I think it's been such a deep-seated problem. It's not just a problem that's emerged over the past decade, really. But one of the ways that I think we're trying to look at it is we've set up something called the Productivity Commission, which has been looking at and producing papers on and taking evidence on some of these issues and holding regular meetings. And I just encourage people to have a look at our website and look for the link to Productivity Commission. And I think you'll find some really useful and helpful answers to sort of some of the questions you raise. But I don't think, due respect to the people on the commission, we actually have the answer as such.
Yeah, thank you very much, Barry, and especially for recommending the Productivity Commission, which I was about to do, but you stole my thunder on that one. The trouble with productivity is, of course, there are a number of possible explanations, which mean that there are a number of possible policy recommendations, and nothing in isolation. There is no silver bullet, I don't think. And one thing I've learned over the years is you don't solve a productivity issue quickly. But yes, go have a look at what the Productivity Commission is doing. Strongly recommend that. Okay, another batch of 3 questions quickly. David Cobham first. David.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can hear you now. It's great, by the way, to well, I would say see you, but I can't. But to hear your voice, David, it's good to hear from you.
I just wanted to ask whether the National Institute can see a way in which significant increases can be made in public sector wages towards, but probably not above inflation, without creating serious inflationary dangers. I think that would be a very useful answer that you could give.
Thank you, David. That's one for Kumar to ponder. Next, I'm going to go to Jeremy Holmes. Jeremy.
Can you hear me okay?
We can indeed.
I just wondered what intelligence you had on the appetite in government for either the variable price cap or the National Development Bank, both of which sound quite significant policy ideas. But I wonder what the level of receptivity is in government for those.
That's a good question, because of course, you can suggest policies, but unless you find the receptive people within government, they're not going to happen, good or ill. I'll leave Arnab to answer that one. But first, I'll turn to Glenn Bramley.
Can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Yes, this was a question for Arnab, and it's a little bit, I think, slightly more long-term rather than the immediate cost of living crisis. But it's about to make progress with levelling up. Do you also see a role for what one might call more aggressive policies on taxation and ownership issues targeting the overinflated London housing market? Do you see any kind of role for those kind of measures, foreign ownership, differential tax rates, more capital gains tax, all that sort of stuff?
Thank you very much, Glenn. Okay, we'll go to Kumar first. Can we give public sector workers higher pay without stoking inflation?
Thanks for the question, David. I'm sure public sector workers would hope the answer to that is yes. But I can't see it happening without contributing to the wage inflation, especially at the rates that of increase that public sectors would be expecting and wanting. And as we've seen what what various unions have been asking for on behalf of public sector workers, and that's one of the things that for example, the bank has been contending with, where not just the sort of inflationary pressures coming from Europe, but also from the labor market with the strong demand for wages. So whilst there is, I think, room for, wage increases for public sector workers, the degree to which it, we might see one that is close to or above, certainly not above, but close to inflation, I can't see it, especially without seeing that contributing to inflationary pressures in the economy and potentially this wage price spiral. And we have to take into consideration that we have had strong sort of pressures from private sector as well with wage demand. So in short, I don't see it.
Thank you, Kumar. Arnab, you have two. You have one on the should we do something about the London housing market, and then one on the is government receptive to our policy suggestions, or maybe?
Right. I think these are both brilliant questions. Thank you, Jeremy, first of all, for the questions. So, okay, the point that we have been making for a while is that at the same time as there is some question as to how much fiscal headroom the government has available to support households in need, or to use fiscal policy to support households in need, there also seems to be an inclination or policies which try to distribute welfare across the whole of the distribution rather than targeting. Now, in the case of the energy support, this has taken the form of giving all households a certain amount of money. Now, this somehow seems to be to us to be wasteful, particularly against the context of pressures on government finances itself. Is the government thinking about some kind of variable price caps? Yes, certainly there have been experiments thinking about it. How strongly is it thinking? When is it going to come in? Unfortunately, we do not have good answers to those questions. Our job here is to put policy prescriptions in front of the government for them to consider, and we will find out whether they do that or not. But certainly, it seems to us to be a good way of moving towards, a net zero transition, which is fair to everyone in society. At the same time, discourage high-income households from consuming too much energy by discouraging high-income households consuming too much energy. So, so that's our way of viewing this. And sort of a similar answer also comes for Glenn. By the way, another fantastic idea, is there appetite? Will this be useful? It could. Have we done some experiments to find out how useful? No, not yet. Is there enough political appetite to do it at the moment? We don't think so. But in the face of strong challenges across the country, I suppose one is to look at all possible avenues. Taxes certainly, but also more targeted taxes at certain segments, and this seems to me to be something that should be on the table. And if it is on the table, then we can potentially try to take a stab at how it might be implemented or what its fiscal implications might be. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnab. Time for a couple more very quick questions, hopefully. So one is from somebody marked Trade Secretary. I don't know if that is our Trade Secretary or not, but Trade Secretary, if you'd like to ask your question. I think you need to unmute yourself, or we need to unmute you. I'm looking at my virtual assistant, who I can't actually see, but can we unmute Trade Secretary, or is the problem at their end?
I think it may be a problem their end.
Okay, in which case, forgive me, I'll ask the question. It's for Barry. It's how has the economic inflation affected Commonwealth nations globally? Okay, and one more question from Manish Singh. Manish, can you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Can you hear me?
We can. Hi.
So thank you very much for the presentation. And this is taking into what Arnab has said, because Arnab clearly highlighted that the decile 2 to 5, they are the ones who have more impact or have been more impacted than the lowest decile because of government help. That comes back to my point that whenever I attend these presentations, a lot of, we have to make an optimist case, like what the policy response should be. Should people be allowed to keep more of their money? So my question to Kemar is that did you model the policies that were being proposed, which sadly has not been implemented, and which means that if you don't move the threshold for taxation, clearly it's a tax on the people rather than anything else. Did you manage to model any of these things which then could be shown to the policymakers that it would have a positive impact on the economy? Because right now OBR seems to be driving fiscal policy.
So I think the question is, suppose we had actually seen the Liz Truss quasi-quater mini budget implemented, what would that mean for GDP and inflation? What would it mean for government finances? I think we should be able to possibly be able to answer that one. Anyway, I'm going to go to Barry first.
Okay, but I mean, in brief, it's always a sort of truism to say different countries have different experiences. But in terms of inflation in Commonwealth countries, I can only really speak for probably 3 or 4. So if I look at, say, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK, last year they saw inflation rates on average double or more than double the previous year. India, on the other hand, saw inflation only a little bit higher than the previous year. It's a bit like many of the emerging economies have different experiences of inflation and haven't seen the sort of surge in inflation. It's really been, I feel, a feature of advanced economies rather than emerging economies in terms of the way the average rate of inflation has risen. In terms of our Niger model, we don't really model explicitly all those other Commonwealth countries that exist. So those are really only the ones I can speak for. So, I mean, I think that looking more widely and using emerging economies as a sort of code for that, one would expect to see sort of a wider range of experience, perhaps even with some countries not seeing very much of an increase in inflation at all. I hope that helps you anyway.
Thanks, Barry. Liz Truss budget, Kemal.
Thanks for the question. I hope I've heard it well. I'm not sure how much of it I caught, but well, I mean, clearly the impact on clearly that would have impacted growth and inflation. And I don't know if you've had a chance to see NFR analysis around the mini budget, you would have seen that the impact of the tax cuts that were implemented and the spending stimulus would have had short-term positive impact on our outlook for growth, but then clearly that wouldn't have been sort of a sustainable path in the long run. So essentially that it would have been sort of a demand-led growth, if you like. So it would have been mostly on the demand side, which we know in terms of long run, our potential growth is not one that is sort of sustainable for the economy. So to answer your question, the growth path would be different in the sense that it might have been a sort of stronger sort of outlook for growth for this year in the short term, but in the medium to long run, then the outlook would have clearly been worse off.
Thank you very much, Kemal. We're 5 minutes over, so I'm going to call this to an end. I'd like to thank everybody, and I look forward to again seeing you all. Seeing that you're all there online is probably a better way of saying it. In 3 months' time, when we do spring economic forum, I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Thank you.